like to welcome everyone here tonight to the CFACT speech as part of Conservative Awareness Week. I'm Tyler McNeil. I'm the treasurer for CFACT, which is Collegians for Constructive Tomorrow. This event is put on in conjunction with the Young Americans for Liberty, so we'd like to thank them as well for being here with us. Thank you, Alex, for joining us tonight. I'm very happy to have you. This is actually his second time being here for CFACT, so we always enjoy having him. We'd also like to thank the Weismann Art Museum for letting us use the venue tonight. It was very nice of them. So a little bit about Alex. Alex is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. He is an expert on energy and industrial policy. He is called the most original thinker of the year by political commentator John McLaughlin, and he champions the use of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, and has changed the way thousands of people think about energy. He has risen to prominence as the nation's leading free market energy debater, promoting a philosophy that is anti-pollution but pro-development. He challenges many popularly held beliefs about energy, industry, and the environment, including the big picture benefits and costs of fossil fuels and nuclear power. He draws on cutting-edge research and original insights to offer an alternate perspective on the energy debate and shares eye-opening thoughts into how fossil fuels and technology will improve the lives of people safely, cleanly, and effectively for many years to come. And before I introduce him, I'd like to play this short video first.
Told our fossil fuel usage would bring ecological disaster on a cataclysmic scale. Earth was supposed to be uninhabitable by now. Yet, life is better than ever. People around the world have climbed out of unspeakable poverty. By any measure, our environment is better than it's ever been. This, all powered by coal, oil, and natural gas. But how? How could the experts have been so wrong? Not only wrong, but hysterical and reactionary and rude, stifling progress in the process. I'm Alex Epstein, founder of the Center for Industrial Progress, and I have a question. Isn't it time someone made the moral case for the use of more fossil fuels? Wind and solar power remain unreliable. Fossil fuels burn cleaner and cheaper than ever to advance our growing world. They save lives in operating rooms, fight famine, heat and cool homes in the most extreme places. Without fossil fuels, society slides backwards. It's good that we use fossil fuels. Our world would be better if we used more. We can no longer deny the big picture, the real picture. The truth must be exposed. The time is now. It's here. The moral case for fossil fuels.
All right, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alex Epstein.
All right, quick factual correction. That is not my voice in the video. In case there are any reporters here. So, this is fun. How many of you saw me either in 2012 or 2011? I'm just curious. Yeah, so this is actually, CFACT has a very special place in my heart. Was Bill Gillis here, or did he already get bored and leave? Oh, no. It's a flag. So, so in 2011, I had this idea that I was working at another place, the Ayn Rand Institute, as the energy person, but I had this idea. There needs to be a positive organization that's the opposite of what we call the green movement, something that doesn't focus on saving the planet from human beings, but focus on how do we improve the planet for human beings. And I had this idea. The first person I called, because it's the only person I knew who hired speakers, was Bill Gillis. And I said, hey, Bill, can I speak for you guys? Hey, Bill, he's right there. So it's very fun. Subsequently, fortunately, more organizations have invited me to speak, so it's gone pretty well since then, and the book has done well, but sort of CFAC was my beginning, so I'm always very grateful to Bill, and it's exciting to be back in Minnesota. All right, so you probably have noticed I have this inconspicuous shirt here. I love fossil fuels. Now, I don't have a shirt for everyone, sorry, but I do have, if you want it, I have this I love fossil fuels pin, which anyone can have, but you have to fill out your handout, because hopefully the ideas today will get you excited, and the only way to stay engaged with them is to make sure that we're in contact, so that's to get on our list, so come up and get one if you want. All right, now, another thing I get with this shirt, some people want one. The usual thing though is, why are you wearing this shirt? And you might think, well, I heard it was, isn't it conservative week or something here? This is a conservative group, so it's a safe place. So you might think I'm wearing it to ingratiate myself to the conservative hosts, but no, this shirt was actually invented to wear at anti-fossil fuel rallies. So I thought I'd show you a little clip just to see that I'm serious about this. This is from New York City, and they had an anti-fossil fuel rally last year called the People's Climate March, and there were 100,000 people protesting against fossil fuels and one person protesting for fossil fuels. So here's just a little clip. Do you hear what they're saying? Hey, hey, ho, ho, fossil fuels have got to go. I have a very different opinion on the matter. Let's go see if we can engage. Can we just go stand in the middle? And if you notice what happens, fill out your handout. There are 12 videos where you can see what ensued. Anyway, when I'm at that rally, number one thing I get probably almost anywhere is why are you here? Why are you wearing this shirt? Why are you here? And the two guesses I always get are, one, you represent the fossil fuel industry, you're with the fossil fuel industry, they paid you to be here, so never represented the industry, but I'd say more importantly, I didn't even know anyone from the industry for the first 5 years that I worked on this stuff. So right or wrong, it was my own idea. And then the second thing is, well, you must come from an area that's very pro-fossil fuels, you know, where you have a heritage, maybe you came from West Virginia or Houston or Calgary or one of these hubs. So that's not exactly true. I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is right outside DC, and if you don't know, DC isn't like a huge pro-fossil fuel hub in the world. So, no, and I grew up learning what probably most of us learn, particularly most of us maybe under 40, which is that fossil fuels are immoral. Fossil fuels are an addiction. They are destroying our planet through resource depletion, through pollution, through catastrophic climate change, and we need to get off that addiction. So I had no expectation, even when I was in college, that I would ever become involved with this issue. I had the idea, well, I probably thought the claims against fossil fuels were exaggerated, but certainly nothing prompted me to think, oh, I really like fossil fuels, or I would fight for them or spend my time, and yet I'm going to try to convince you that it's worth your time. So what changed me? Well, I did have a background that I think really shaped me in this way, and that is that in college I became really interested in moral philosophy as my favorite subject, and it still is. So philosophy is really all about how do we think carefully about issues of right and wrong, the biggest issues in life. And I became really interested in how to do that. And when I started studying energy, I came to the conclusion that even though a lot of the people talking about energy are scientists and really smart people and famous columnists, the way we're taught to think about energy is incredibly illogical and should fail any freshman logic class. And so the more I thought about this, the more I concluded that this just does not make any sense the way we're thinking about energy, and we're going to get really bad results if we keep doing it. So here's an example. When we're thinking about any choice in life, any course of action, one of the big issues is we always have to look carefully with anything at both the costs and the benefits of every alternative, and you have to do that carefully. So with anything in life, we have have to look carefully at the cost and benefits of all the alternatives. But then I thought, well, is this what's happening in energy? And no, because I went to one of the top 10 universities in the country, and at no point did I hear one positive thing about fossil fuels. All I heard were negative things. And at the same time, at not one point during that entire time did I hear one negative thing about solar and wind. I only heard positive things. So even without knowing the details I could know, I'm not getting an objective picture here. This is biased. It's impossible that solar and wind have only benefits and no costs. So that was one thing. So we're not really thinking carefully about it, because to think carefully about something means to look at the big picture, to look at both the positives and negatives of everything. Another thing was also that the way we use words in the energy debate is astonishingly unclear. Astonishingly. So in philosophy, usually in intro philosophy class, you read about Socrates. And Socrates was the first major philosopher, and one thing he was known for was going up to people who were using words a certain way and saying, well, what do you really mean by that? So one guy's talking about justice and saying, well, I'm going to put this guy in jail, or I have to prosecute my father because it's the just thing to do. And Socrates says, well, what do you mean by justice? And the guy can't really give an answer. And you get the idea, well, you should probably be clear on what justice means before you start trying to get people thrown in jail on the basis of what's just. And I thought, well, this really applies to this energy issue. So for instance, the number one term we hear in energy, so you ask someone, somebody says, do you believe in climate change? And my answer is, well, I'd like to know what you mean by climate change, because I've heard about 10 different versions of climate change, all the way from climate inherently changes, we're changing climate a little, we're changing climate a mild amount, we're changing it a lot, there's a catastrophe, or there's such a catastrophe that we should support President Obama's current policy. So you'll hear things like 97% of climate scientists agree, so you should support my policy. But if they just agree that it's mild warming, that doesn't mean you should support a dramatic restriction on fossil fuels. So you really need to know exactly what you mean, and you need to be precise, otherwise you can't make the right decision. So this is all independent of what the facts turn out to be. It's just the method that we're using is wrong. But even if you have all the right facts, if you use the wrong method, you're going to always get the wrong conclusion. That was one. So we're not thinking about it carefully. We're not looking at the big picture. We're not using clear definitions. And then one more thing that's really important is whenever we're thinking about an important moral issue, we always need to be clear about what is our goal. What are we trying to accomplish? And let's take the climate issue there. This was really confusing because it seemed on the one hand like people said, I care about CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere because it's bad for human beings if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so that might be true. I could investigate that. But then I would look at, okay, well, if we want to reduce CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, one thing to look at is what are the best technologies that we know of for producing energy without generating CO2? And you pretty quickly find there are two. One is called nuclear power, and the other is hydroelectric power. And then you look at, well, who are the biggest opponents? Who are the biggest people holding back that technology? You find out, wait, it's the green movement, the self-proclaimed environmentalists, the same people who say that they're concerned about CO2. So then I asked, well, wait, you wanted to reduce CO2, but we know from, say, France, which is 60-70% nuclear for electricity, that you can reduce CO2. I'm not saying this is the right goal, but if that was the right goal, by using nuclear, yet we don't want to use it. And then I say, why is that? And then I get a response, something like, well, there's a lot of radiation or something. Like, well, is that necessarily dangerous? And they say, well, it's kind of, it's unnatural, we don't want to do that. It's better to use the sun in the way. But I'll respond, well, what if it's less efficient? What if it costs a lot more? Isn't the goal to benefit? So it seems like they want to benefit human life, but then when I push on it, it's not really about human life, it's about being natural. I say, what about the hydroelectric dam? That doesn't have any radiation. What's going on there? And they say, well, it's going to get in the way of the salmon. And okay, well, but if we could avoid a global catastrophe, wouldn't that be worth getting in the way of salmon for? Like, civilization's going to end, but you're not willing to build a dam because it's going to get in the way. So what's our goal here? So there's something really off where we're not really clear about what our goal in the whole discussion is, and we're not carefully thinking about how to get there. So if in life, you don't know what your destination is, and you have no concept of how to get there, you're going to have a really bad time. And so I consider our energy discussion a really bad time. It's just complete chaos. People arguing about, they don't know where we're going, they don't know how to get there, and so everyone's just arguing, and you're not going to make the right decision. So And this is regardless of what the facts turn out to be. So the point I'm making applies whatever impact CO2 in the atmosphere has. So it's really not about fossil fuels. The key issue when I say the moral case for fossil fuels is all about moral. How do you think carefully about what's right and wrong? And we're not doing that. So my mission in thinking about the issue and getting to the bottom of it, because it's really hard to get, because people aren't expressing it clearly, is what are the facts and how do I think carefully about them? So the way I think of it is this. The goal is, another way to think of it is called a moral standard. So here's how, when I look at any given fact and I look at all the facts, I'm going to measure them and evaluate them all by this standard. So using more fossil fuels or using less fossil fuels is moral to the extent if, when we carefully take into account all the positives, negatives, and alternatives, it's overall beneficial to human well-being, human survival, human flourishing, human progress. So, and that's not, all of that is controversial, as in I don't believe any of that is done carefully, and I'm on record as saying, if it's really between the human and the salmon, I'm choosing the human. And we're going to talk about how a lot of people actually, whether they know it or not, are choosing the salmon. But I'm giving you I want to have all my cards on the table. What I'm looking for is the human answer. So I'm going to argue using more fossil fuels is the best course of action for human life. If that's the goal, that's the answer. But that I think is the methodology that's missing. And it doesn't matter, you often hear 97% of scientists, or scientists say this, or look what Stephen Hawking just, like, I don't care what anyone says or what their position is if they're not following a logical method. Stephen Hawking is one of the most irrational people I've ever encountered on this issue. If you read his stuff, he doesn't look at any benefits of fossil fuels. And then he says, well, I'm a really smart scientist who talks through a computer, whatever. And there are movies made about me, therefore we should shut down fossil fuels. Well, you don't get to do that. You don't get to intimidate people. So what a scientist needs to do, how a scientist can contribute to this, is he can say, hey, Alex, guess what? I know a lot about CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Let me explain to you how this amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is dangerous or not. But scientists have to contribute to this project. So we don't have any authorities here. We just have contributors who can give us a big picture. But it's all about what is the best thing for human life, and everyone should be contributing to that. If they're not, it's too bad. They don't deserve a voice, so you shouldn't listen to them. All right. So here's a question. If our goal is to figure out what's the relationship between fossil fuels and human life going forward, are they going to make it better? Are they going to make it worse? What should we do? There's one question I have that I find really interesting that is hard, people find really hard to answer. Because I'll often have discussions with people and they'll say to me, well, this is what I think about fossil fuels, or how can you say that, or this is what don't you know this, and don't you know that? And I'll say, great, let's talk about all that, but first I have a question. What are fossil fuels? So how many people in here think now I know we have a couple of engineers in here, so feel free to raise your hand, but think you give me a good definition of what fossil fuels are? Like when we're talking about them, what exactly are we talking about? Okay, well, yeah, Tyler, I bet you could. Bill, yeah, I hope so. But it's interesting, right? We feel a little bit uncomfortable, but isn't it odd that we're in a society where we're very encouraged to take very strong stances on things, but not to be clear on even what we're talking about? So that's a problem no matter where we end up in the issue. So what I'm going to do today is I want to start with what are fossil fuels, and then I'm going to look at what I think are the key potential benefits of using fossil fuels, and then the key potential costs using the methodology that I give. But if you understand what fossil fuels are, it makes it a lot easier. So, what are fossil fuels? This is my simplified definition. I think captures the two elements you need to get. So there's high energy hydrocarbons, many of which originated from ancient dead plants. So what you can see, sort of very easy way to think of it is, all of you have looked at nutrition labels, right? We're always supposed to look at nutrition labels to figure out, can we eat this, can't we, is it going to make it fat, is it going to make it skinny, this kind of thing. And what element on the nutrition label has the most calories per gram? So there's fat, right? There's fat, carbohydrate, protein, and alcohol. Which one has the most calories per gram? Is fat, right? So that means the most energy is stored in a small amount of space. And then the one with the least are carbohydrates and protein. So the way you can kind of think of it is, over time, what happened with fossil fuels is that plants, which are carbohydrates, they pile up over time and they get compressed, and everything gets squeezed out of them except for a lot of energy. And so they become like fat. So like oil, you have olive oil, like that's a lot like the oil you get out of the ground or the oil that's in your gas tank. There's a reason why they're both called oil. So what's happening over time is you get this energy that gets compressed from the plant form to this super compressed plant form that has lots and lots of energy in a very small space. And this is useful for a lot of reasons we'll get into, but most obviously, the smaller the space and the lower the weight you can compress something into, the easier it is to, say, move yourself around. Right? So imagine your gasoline weighed 10 times as much. Your car would be much less fuel efficient, right? Or if your gas tank was 10 times less dense, you need to have a much, much bigger fuel tank. So this is why, for instance, all planes run on oil fuel, because there's nothing else that stores that much energy in that amount of space. If you put a battery in a plane, the plane will never take off. The battery will have all that energy. So anyway, this is the core kind of idea here is hydrocarbon. Hydrocarbon is the configuration of molecules that stores a lot of energy, and it comes from ancient dead plants. Now, why is this important in understanding? Well, because there are 4 basic consequences of this process, of it being a hydrocarbon from ancient dead plants, that explain both the potential benefits and the potential costs of using fossil fuels. So in terms of the benefits, there are a lot of plants over time that piled up to create these fuels, like a lot. So it doesn't mean we can get all of them easily, but there's dozens of times more oil in the ground in various forms than we've used in the entire history of civilization. Doesn't mean we can get it all, but in terms of just the amount of the stuff, it's just completely staggering how much there is in the ground. So it comes from plants. So there were a lot of these plants. And the other thing is, it's in this very small, it's in this very compact form, and it turns out it's pretty efficient to turn it into energy. So what it provides is CPR energy, means cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. So the fact that it's these high energy substances coming from lots and lots of plants means we have lots and lots of potential energy that we can get if we know how to harness it. So that's the benefit. But then you run into some potential challenges. So one is, these are hydrocarbons. So hydrogen, carbon. Well, when you burn something, that means you add oxygen to it. So what happens when you add oxygen to carbon? What do you get? Anyone know? CO2, carbon dioxide, right? So that's the thing. And when we put more CO2 in the atmosphere, it's what's called a greenhouse gas or an infrared absorber. And basically the sun, probably know enough about optics. The sun puts light on the Earth. There are different spectrum. There's a whole spectrum of different kinds of light. What's called infrared light bounces off the surface of the Earth, hits the CO2. The more of it is, the more of it there is, the more bounces back and hits the Earth, and so there's a little bit more warmth in the system. So every time you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, all things being equal, you can expect there to be a little more warmth in the atmosphere. Now, I'm not saying that there's a huge amount or a small amount, but that's a known effect. So that's the kind of thing that we need to pay attention to. Is that a big deal? Is it not? The next thing that is interesting, which comes from it being plants. Now, plants have all sorts of materials in them, including certain plants that evolved into fossil fuels, not really evolved, but that were compressed into fossil fuels, have sulfur in them. So when we burn something that had sulfur in it, what we get is something called sulfur dioxide, which causes smog. So if you have enough of that and enough concentration, this ancient plant energy can cause smog. Another thing that can happen, some of the plants that led to coal had mercury in them, and so you could be putting mercury in there. So when we're burning these ancient dead plants, we need to be concerned about if we burn ones with the wrong elements in a tight enough concentration, we can cause certain kinds of health problems. And then the final thing, which hasn't been as much of a concern lately, but when I started talking about this was a bigger concern, is the idea that, well, because it comes from plants, we're eventually going to run out. Now, the way fossil fuels work is that they're created over millions and millions of years. And actually, new fossil fuels are being created every day, but we use them at a much faster rate than they're being created. So the idea is, shouldn't we be worried about running out of this stuff? Because we're using them at a much faster rate than we're creating them. So this is, it's called peak oil, or the depletion problem. So another thing we need to investigate this. Is it really a big problem? Is this something immediate? Is this something 10,000 years in the future? Is it in between? What do we do about this? So those are sort of the 4 big things. And so then the mission is, we need to look at both sides. We need to look, what is the benefit in all these areas? So on access to energy, on climate livability, on environmental quality, on resource availability. Is using more fossil fuels going to bring us forward, or is it going to bring us back? And to understand, we need to look at all of these different elements. So let's look at, first, access to energy. Before I do this, so I think that this person has a lot to offer on this issue. You guys recognize him? This is Jimmy Fallon. So Jimmy Fallon made, I think, one of the world's best cases for why we use fossil fuels, even though Jimmy Fallon is actually against fossil fuels. He's a member of Artists Against Fracking. He thinks he is, but I think if he really understood his own argument, he'd realize that he's very pro-fossil fuels. But the question I always get is, well, why don't we just use, and I had this when I was a kid, why don't we just use solar? Isn't the sun free? Right? Let's just use energy from the sun and the wind. Isn't that inevitably going to be the cheapest? Won't that be free? So Jimmy Fallon gives a really good answer to this.
New Scientist magazine reported on Wednesday that in the future, cars could be powered by hazelnuts. That's encouraging, considering an 8-ounce jar of hazelnuts costs about $9. Yeah, I got an idea for a car that runs on bald eagle heads and Fabergé eggs.
Could you hear that in the back? Okay. So think about that. So why do I bring that up? Well, hazelnut energy is renewable energy, right? Where does hazelnuts get their energy from? It's natural. It comes from the sun. Why is it so expensive? Why is that little jar so expensive? And why do we hear that solar and wind are expensive? Well, the key idea that Jimmy brings up, but doesn't realize it, is that all energy, there's no such thing as nature just giving us energy. Like, nature doesn't just give us energy from the sun. We have to process it. The key concept is that every form of energy is a manufacturing process. So every form of energy is a manufacturing process. And to be cheap and plentiful and reliable, for lots of people to be able to have energy, every element of the process needs to be cheap and plentiful and reliable. So if the sun is, quote, free, but all the elements needed to process it are expensive, then solar energy is really, really expensive. So there's all kinds of elements now. You have mining and processing and manufacturing and transportation, all of these different things from end to end. If we're thinking about what is a good form of energy, we need to look at the whole thing. And if we look at fossil fuels, the trend is overwhelmingly, we keep using more and more. So 1980, it happens to be the year I was born, we used a certain amount of fossil fuels. And many people at the time said, well, we can get off fossil fuels. We can replace it with solar and wind. And yet, since then, we use over 80% more fossil fuels than we did back then. Now, is that really a conspiracy? A lot of people think it's a conspiracy because, well, the sun is free, shouldn't we just be using the sun? But no, the reason is because of all of these elements. Because it turns out that the manufacturing process of turning these ancient dead planets into energy is way more efficient than these other methods, particularly solar and wind. So here's a good way of looking at solar and wind. Germany is supposedly the world leader in solar and wind technology. So you often hear, oh, Germany gets 40% of their energy from solar and wind, and they're on their way to getting 100%. And this is really dishonest, anyone who says this kind of thing. So this is the actual data from the source in Germany. So if you look at that, first of all, this is electricity production. So the top is the average electricity production on a monthly basis. For various reasons, they only allow you to know the data on a monthly basis. But first of all, this is only half of Germany's energy usage, because half of Germany's energy usage is for things that you could relate to in Minnesota, particularly heating during the winter, especially, and then fuel. So this only covers half of it, and none of their energy for that comes from solar and wind. But look at the electricity. So this is just electricity. You see that occasionally there are spikes where it might get up to 40%, but most of the time it's not, and particularly notice that a lot of the time it goes low, and particularly it goes low in the winter months when Germany needs the most energy. Now, your need for energy is constant. You need energy on demand. But solar and wind, because they come from the sun and the wind, are unreliable. So what happens? What do you need to do if you can't count on it? Well, it means you always need to have reliable energy available. And this is why, as they're building more and more solar and wind facilities, Germany is building more and more coal plants. So think about that. The whole purpose was allegedly to replace coal, but they're using coal. So they could shut down all the solar and wind plants, and they would just be left with a more reliable network. They'd be totally fine in terms of energy. But if they shut down a bunch of the coal plants, they would be in huge, huge trouble. So really the solar and wind are on life support from the reliable sources of energy. So we're taught to call them renewables. I don't think that makes any sense because it has all these processes that aren't renewable at all. But more importantly, we should call them unreliables because that's what they are at the core. They're unreliable. So the idea that in our discussion people talk about, oh, we need to get rid of fossil fuels and replace it with solar and wind, that is really scary that people talk about that. And it's noteworthy, as I mentioned before, that nobody talks about nuclear and hydro. That the same people opposed to fossil fuels are opposed to nuclear and hydro. So they seem willing to oppose everything. They are only willing to advocate really imaginary energy, forms of energy that don't work, but they're opposed to every form of practical energy. And as a society, I don't just mean a small group of people, I mean our society. In the national discussion, everyone takes it for granted, we should use solar and wind, that's the ideal. That does not make any sense to me. Now, if we look at the places that do use more fossil fuels, so Germany has done all of this. They have lots of coal capacity, so they're not having blackouts. But their electricity is 4 times more expensive than Americans' electricity. So just imagine you open you go to Germany, and then you open up your electricity bill, and it's 4 times more. In Germany, the term energy poverty is now a popular term in the society because so many people have high electric bills. So this is crazy. I was in Belgium recently, giving a talk, and there were some pretty wealthy people who were in the room that I was having a discussion with, and they just casually mentioned to me, as if they're talking about the weather, oh yeah, by the way, we built a lot of windmills in the last couple of years, so our electricity prices went up by 3 times. Well, that sounds like a pretty big deal. But, for them it wasn't that big a deal, but for the normal people, it's a huge deal, for the non-rich. Now, if we look at the other side of the story, is the people who have used fossil fuels, despite often being in governments that don't handle these issues very well, their lives have gotten a lot better. So if we look at China and India, we have life expectancy in both countries increasing 6+ years, which just means, and that's just unbelievable. You think of what it means to have a chance of living, the average person will live 6 more years compared to what they used to. They used to live. And then with income, we have a similar kind of dynamic, where income is skyrocketing. And you might say, well, is this just a correlation? Is it just random chance that the fact that India and China both use 5 times more coal and 5 times more oil than they did several decades ago, maybe that's just, maybe it was just something else. Well, but if we understand how energy works, definitely not. Because the way to think of energy is the industry that powers every other industry. Because what energy, I like to think of it as machine fuel or machine calories. So I need calories in let's say I need 2,000, 2,500 calories in my body a day to do what I do. Well, every machine that we use to improve our lives, it also needs calories to do what it does. But the average American has about 100 times more energy being used by all of our machines doing work for us than we ourselves use. So if we don't have the calories to power those machines, then they are useless. They're just scrapping. Like our computer doesn't work. It's just like when your iPhone runs out of charge. It's just a useless thing. So that's fundamental, and it's true of every area of life. Like if you're the machines that produce clothing, if they run out of fuel, we're back to manual labor. And so what these societies have gone through is they've gone from a manual labor society to a machine labor society, and energy is the crucial part of that. You need machines and you need energy, and it needs to be affordable to everyone. So the more expensive it is, the fewer people can afford it. And one other way I like to think of it, I assume most of you have been to a Walmart before, right? So have you ever seen the falling prices things that they use in ads and stuff, and they show the prices falling? So the way energy works is because energy is behind everything, energy is the industry behind everything else. When energy is cheaper, everything is cheaper. And when energy is more expensive, everything else is more expensive. So the way I think of it is, when energy goes down, it's like everything has the falling prices. When energy goes up, everything has the rising prices. I mean, that's how fundamental it is. So if we think globally, if we're thinking of what are the benefits of using fossil fuels, using more fossil fuels means billions of people can have more energy. There's no other technology today, even nuclear and hydro today, that can scale to billions of people, giving them more energy. So that's the unique benefit, that if you restrict fossil fuels, you restrict, and people are talking about restricting it by a huge amount. At the conference this November, or later this year in Paris, they're talking about 80% bans on fossil fuels over the next 30, 35 years. So there are billions of, just to give you context, in the last several decades, you've had billions of people come out of poverty using fossil fuels, and we still have 3 billion people around the world who have almost no energy, who have basically no energy compared to us. And over 1 billion who have no electricity. So there are people in the last 30, 40 years who are getting their first refrigerator, their first light bulb, their first decent job, and that's been made possible by fossil fuels. And there are more people who want to do that. And to say we need to restrict it means we're going back to where they used to be, we're going there, and certainly no new people are going to have the opportunity to do it. I mean, that's how serious it is. So even, we're going to get to climate in a second, but let's even say that there was a serious problem from putting more CO2 in the atmosphere. I still think the way we're taught to think about fossil fuels would be bizarre and illogical and unfair, because if it turned out that we had to restrict a lot of fossil fuel use, that would be a tragedy. Because what it would mean is, if we use a lot of fossil fuels, we're going to have a climate catastrophe, and if we don't, we're going to have an energy catastrophe, both of which would be human catastrophes. So the people who believe that fossil fuels are catastrophic and their side effects should be mourning the loss of fossil fuels. They should be upset. They should think it's a tragedy. But I don't hear anyone acting like it's a tragedy. People are just gleeful. Oh, we don't have to use fossil fuels. Oil sucks. Well, no, it doesn't. It's this amazing thing for improving human life. And if it actually had this inevitable flaw to it, that would be really bad. So we live in a society that does not seem to care about the benefits to human life of fossil fuels. It only seems fixated on the negative. So I think even before exploring the climate impacts, we should be suspicious of this narrative that, oh, fossil fuels are this evil addiction. It's not right to think of it as cigarettes or heroin or something like that. It's something that's unbelievably positive. Nevertheless, we still need to look at the potential negatives. So let's look at climate, and this is really what I want to focus on tonight. Okay. So first thing, remember I said earlier that I judge everything by human well-being. Does this benefit human well-being or not? Now, if you notice something about our discussion of climate, most discussions of climate aren't really focused on human well-being. And here's my proof of this. We always talk about climate change. So someone will ask me, do you believe in climate change? And I mentioned before, it's really vague, and that's part of the problem. But there's another aspect of this too, which is, why are you using the term climate change? Because what I'm concerned about as a human being is, I want to make sure that we're not doing something to the atmosphere that's making human life worse. I'm worried about climate danger, but I'm not worried about climate change as such. For example, a couple years ago we had Superstorm Sandy in New York. I would love a way to change climate to prevent that. I would love a way to change climate in lots of ways to make it safer for human life. And for that matter, we change climate on a local basis constantly. This room is an example of local climate change, right? We make climate much more pleasant for us. And if we could do that in other ways, we probably would choose to. What we're interested in, but we don't want negative climate change. We don't want climate danger, or at least we don't want to add more climate danger to nature. But talking about it as climate change is a problem because it makes the question, are we doing anything that has an impact versus are we creating a real danger? And what I'm concerned about is, are we creating a real danger? Because what I'm concerned about, is there anything that fossil fuels are causing that is so bad that we need to take away some of the benefits we get? Because we know restricting fossil fuels will take away benefits, so we need to make sure if we're taking those away that it really makes sense to do so. So the way to look at climate danger, climate livability, is I think we need to look at three things. So one is this greenhouse effect I mentioned before. Is that a really serious thing? Is it a minor thing? What is it? Then the other two things we need to look at, which are almost never discussed, are we need to look at potentially positive impacts. But with greenhouse effect, we also need to look at, is it better to be warm? It might be, if it gets a little warmer, that's better. We also need to look at, though, what about plant life? We learn in school that the more CO2 you put in the atmosphere, the more plants grow. So maybe using fossil fuels has this beneficial side effect. Maybe we should investigate that, but why don't we ever talk about it? Again, there's a bias. And then also we need to look at, well, how does using more energy from fossil fuels, how does that enable more people to be safe from the climate? Because climate isn't safe naturally. I had this experience when I started the book about a year and 3/4 ago. I was visiting my friends in January, and I got stuck outside my hotel, and it was negative something, whatever you experience around here. I'm from California. And And it was just, like, I felt like my hand is going to freeze off in about 60 seconds. But that's the way climate is, right? So we need to make sure, if we're talking about we want climate to be livable, we want it to be safe, we need to make sure we have the energy so people can heat their homes and build durable structures. We need to look at the big picture with everything. So we're not doing that, we need to do that. So greenhouse effect. Let's just run through a couple things. So first of all, we should notice that if somebody says we're going to have runaway global warming, the world's going to end, my first question is, is there a track record to that prediction? Like, is this a new theory that just came out yesterday? That's a state-of-the-art thing, they just made a discovery and some geniuses are predicting it? Or is this a prediction that has existed for a while that has a track record? Because if it has a track record, that's great, I can study what actually happened. So it turns out this does have a track record of many decades. So for example, about 30 years ago, this guy is the most prominent climate scientist in the media, James Hansen, said that in between the year 2000 and 2010, the temperature would go up from 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, by 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which was more than the temperature had gone up in the past, I think, 300 years before that. So that would be really dramatic, right? You're going along your merry way, and the temperature's going up a little bit, and then it completely spikes in that one direction. And he predicted it. If that happened, that would make me really scared, because we would just, if that continued, you go, maybe you can handle 5 degrees or 10 degrees, but you can't handle 50 degrees average around the Earth. So that would be really alarming. So what actually happened? Well, one thing I'd ask Hansen, even before I looked at that, is, well, why do you expect that to happen? Because people often said, 97% of climate scientists agree, blah, blah, blah. Well, I want to know, what do they agree on? What exactly are they predicting? And why should I believe that the greenhouse effect will lead to this dramatic warming? And one way to ask that is, well, what kind of effect is the greenhouse effect? Because what I was led to believe for a long time, is that the greenhouse effect is what's called an exponential or geometric effect. So it's an accelerating effect, which would mean that every new molecule of CO2 I put in the atmosphere would make it warmer than the last. Which, here's one way to think of it. Like, imagine you're accelerating your car. Okay, so you push, let's say you're 55 miles an hour, you push on the pedal. And every centimeter you push down, the car accelerates more. So the first time you push it, it goes 10 miles an hour more. Second, 20. And then 40, and then 80. And by the time you're done depressing it totally, it's like a rocket ship. So that's what I felt like was true with the atmosphere. I would put more and more CO2, and it just takes off. Well, if that's true, that's really scary. Now, it would be very different if every time you push the pedal down, it was just the same amount of increase in velocity. That would be called a linear function. And that might be cause for concern, but it wouldn't be nearly as dramatic. But then there's what actually happens with your car, which is what happens actually with your car above around 55 is a decelerating function. So every centimeter you put it down usually increases the velocity less than the last one did. So if you have like a Hyundai, it doesn't take off like a rocket ship. It might max out at 110 or 120. And this is what's happening in the atmosphere with, it turns out, CO2, if you isolate it, is a logarithmic effect or a decelerating effect. So that means every new molecule of CO2 you put in the atmosphere warms less than the last one did. And that means we shouldn't be very scared of it, all things being equal, because every new one you put in has less warming. So even if you doubled the amount of the atmosphere, it wouldn't have a huge effect, unless there's something else going on in the atmosphere that even when you put a little bit more, there's some sort of tipping point and that leads to catastrophe. And some people believe that, but they need to be able to prove it. They can't just say, oh, we all agree, or they can't say the greenhouse effect, because the greenhouse effect doesn't lead to this catastrophic expectation. So then we can look at, okay, well, was Hansen right? Did you go up by 2 to 4 degrees between 2000 and 2010? Well, you probably know we didn't, but here's the exact thing that happened. So these things can be confusing. Notice, by the way, on the bottom, notice the numbers on it. So they're very, very small numbers. Like we're talking about 1 degree range or so here. Because we see these graphs, and you can skew a graph as much as you want. I mean, you can make 1 degree look like 100 degrees if you just amplify it enough. So we're looking at 0.8 degrees Celsius over 150 years or so. But notice just if you look at some detail, until around 1930, 1940, CO2 levels are pretty much the same, and then they really start to skyrocket recently. So if this was in fact an accelerating effect, what you'd expect is the thing on the bottom would look more like the thing on the top. It would accelerate. But if you notice, it doesn't. And in particular, between the years 2000 and 2010, what happens? It doesn't go up by 2 to 4 degrees. It doesn't go up at all. It's flat. So we're putting more and more CO2 in the atmosphere than ever, at a faster rate than ever, but the warming is flat, which means what? Which means it doesn't seem like this is a big variable in the atmosphere. It looks like it's a minor deal, but not a big deal. It certainly doesn't look like it's anything worth shutting down a lot of civilization and restricting energy access for. So it seems like, well, if this is the consequence of using lots and lots of fossil fuels, and we get all those benefits, let's keep going. Because there's no negative, and the people who've predicted disaster have been wrong. To give you a little context of how insignificant this is and how much we're making of it, we deal with huge amounts of climate change, if you want to call it that, in terms of weather variation on a daily and monthly basis. Climate is constantly changing in all these different ways that affect our experience. And yet what's happened over 150 years is that overall, on average, it's just a little bit higher, like 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit higher, 8.8 degrees Celsius. So just a slightly warmer. It would be hard to even detect if you didn't know about it thanks to complex instruments. But the way we're taught to think about it is every time there's weather we don't like, it's global warming or climate change. And one of my guests on my podcast today was pointing out that about 10, 15 years ago, everyone was talking about the end of snow. And then we kept getting all this snow, and then they came with a new version of it. Well, when it's warmer, you'll actually get more snow. Which actually, by the way, I think makes more sense than the other version, but nevertheless, there's such a thing in life as something not being that consequential. It's not nothing, but it's not a lot. And we're making a huge deal of something that is a lot and not a lot, and we're talking about restricting dramatically something that is incredibly consequential. So again, we're not thinking carefully about what benefits human life. So the next effects are important as well. So this is the fertilizer effect. This means more CO2 in the atmosphere, all things being equal, means more plant life. So you can isolate this. So here's a scientist who did a lot of experiments with more CO2. So he added more CO2 in the atmosphere, and look what happens. So the tree grows more. His son recreated this with a lot of different things. And you notice every plant you add more CO2 to the atmosphere, and it grows more. Well, that should be relevant in our discussion. Don't we want more plants? Isn't that important? And also, maybe we should be worried because what if we lost CO2 from the atmosphere, which happens during ice ages? Then you have a lot of plant death. So my main point is we're not talking objectively about the positives and negatives. We have this very skewed discussion, which seems to treat every negative as a reason to get rid of fossil fuels and ignores all the positives. So we're guaranteed to make a bad decision. Now, let's talk about the core of the issue, which is this issue of danger. The core issue, if somebody says to me, you're making climate much worse. Part of it is, yes, is there this warming that you're claiming? And we see, no, that did not happen. But the ultimate question is climate becoming more dangerous? Are we making climate more dangerous for human beings? Are all these human beings going to die or dying as they say they are? And it's important, again, this is not a new claim. This is not something that people just came up with. This is something that's been around for decades. So here's John Holdren, who's the highest science official in the land. He was President Obama's science advisor. In 1985, he predicted that there would be 1 billion people dying from CO2-related deaths from the actions of the fossil fuel industry. That's a really serious claim. 1 billion people would die from climate-induced famine. So what happened? Well, that video, you might not have caught this or remembered the stat, but in that video I showed at the beginning, which, as I said, it wasn't my voice, but everything else was true, the amount of famine has actually decreased by 40% since Holdren said this. That means billions of people have, in a growing population, that means billions of people have food who did not have food before. So he was not just wrong, he was the opposite. I was talking with this other guy on a show, like, we don't even have a term in the language for how wrong this is. Now, I'm serious. If someone come up with one, bring it up in the Q&A. But he was the exact opposite of right. Now, you might say, well, haven't other things gotten worse? So sure, he was off by 2 billion in the wrong direction, but, and these are real people. And also, by the way, it's important. It's not like their life expectancy went up and they got food for a reason that's unrelated to fossil fuels. Two of the huge things with food availability are, one, can you have fertilizer? And modern fertilizer that's cheap and abundant comes from natural gas, is derived from natural gas. And then another thing is, can machines produce food really, really efficiently? and the number one fuel used for all farming in the world is diesel fuel, because it allows you to get so much energy from so little fuel. So a modern harvester, a diesel harvester, can harvest enough wheat for 500,000 loaves of bread a day. That's just unbelievable. Think about that. You got one machine, 500,000 loaves of bread a day. Think about what it was like to do with manual labor, or if you strapped a solar panel on the thing, or if you put a windmill in it. I mean, it's unbelievable what this can be done, this can do. And these are the technologies that added, that prevented billions of people from starving, and yet we expected the technologies to make them starve, and there's no accountability. Now you might say, well, okay, there's that, which you should take seriously, but what about storms and floods and heat and cold? Isn't that all getting worse? Isn't Superstorm Sandy becoming more of a daily occurrence? No, blaming it on fossil fuels is a daily occurrence, but the actual deaths from it have declined. We have stats for this. There's a data set called climate-related deaths, which measure over time how many people are dying from climate-related causes, so storms and floods and heat and cold, and this stat is never mentioned. Why? It's starting to, and I can take some credit for it, why it's starting to, but it never was. Why? Because it completely refutes the narrative that we're having a more dangerous climate. So here's the actual correlation between CO2 emissions and climate-related deaths around the world. This is rich countries plus poor countries. The countries with more fossil fuels have far fewer than the rich countries. So it's gone way down. To give you some specific numbers, if you look at 1920, 1930, these are the reason there's not much before that is mostly because we don't have very good data collection back then. But if you take the 30s, we have a couple years in the 30s where you have over 3 million people dying from storms and floods and heat and cold and drought. Drought is probably the worst. 3 million people. That we had a population then less than 1/3 of today. So that's 10 million people in today's population. It's 10 million people die from that around the world. I mean, that's a lot. In 2013, which is supposed to be the worst year ever, for most dangerous year ever, we hear all these stories. Nobody wanted to quantify it, and the reason they didn't was because instead of 10 million deaths, they had under 30,000 deaths in the entire world due to climate, heat and cold. So what happened? That's a crazy change. So what happened? How do you explain this? Well, the way you explain it is that the way we're taught to think about climate is totally backward. The way we're taught to think about climate is nature gave us a perfect climate. It's nice and stable. It cares about us. It nurtures us. But we're messing it up. We put more CO2 in the thing. It goes haywire, and it's punishing us for our transgressions. So it's kind of like it's sending us to hell, right? Global warming, sort of like, earthly hell. Now, this is bizarre. Okay, nature does not give us a safe climate. It gives us an incredibly dangerous climate. The climate is naturally variable. It changes constantly. It's volatile. It changes in dramatic ways. Canada, in the not too distant past, had, thousands of feet of ice over. I mean, think about that. Thousands of feet of ice. Now, if that were today, by the way, we'd be moaning every centimeter of ice that melted over Canada. We'd be moaning about, oh, the Arctic is melting, and this isn't. Because people think nature is static, but it's not. It's the opposite of that. And so climate is variable, it's volatile, and it's vicious. So this is why historically people were terrified of climate. Not in a fake way, not in like I'm going to hold up a sign way, but in a I'm afraid of what the rain is going to do to me. I'm afraid of what the drought is going to do to me. Climate is incredibly dangerous, and it changes in all kinds of ways. For example, we have right now 0.04% of the atmosphere is CO2. Before we started putting more in, it was 0.03%. But historically, there's been 20 times more CO2 in the atmosphere than there is now. We're actually at a fairly low point in geologic history in terms of both temperature and CO2. So the planet has had all different ranges of CO2. It's not like we're creating this magic new amount. We are at a very low historical amount. So the only thing that matters is, are we impacting it in a way that's creating some big problem or not? And then are we helping make ourselves safer from climate? And so what explains these incredible statistics is that by using energy, what we can do is we can take the naturally dangerous climate and we can make ourselves really, really, really safe from it. So we can combat nature's extreme heat and extreme cold through cooling and through heating, and those save millions and millions of lives. We can combat drought through modern agriculture, through drought relief, through irrigation. These save so many millions of lives, and yet nobody talks about them. So the way I think of it is, using fossil fuels doesn't take a safe climate and make it dangerous. It takes a dangerous climate and makes it far, far safer. If you think about the poor people in the world, as the Pope was recently talking about, I care about the poor people, and therefore I want to restrict fossil fuels, that is the wrong reasoning process. Because if you care about the poor people, they need a machine-based society to enrich themselves, and just as much for climate as anything else. If they live in a manual labor society, they are going to be at the mercy of climate, just like everyone else was throughout history. And already we've made them way safer from climate, but it's such a wrong way of thinking about it. I want to take questions in a couple minutes. I just want to show you how the same thread that's true of climate is true of environmental quality and of resources. So the thread that we have so far is we want to look at the big picture of what benefits human life. The potential benefit of fossil fuels we've seen, giving more people access to energy, is something that will make billions of people's lives better. So the risk of not using fossil fuels, those billions of lives get worse. With climate, it was supposed to be a risk. It was supposed to be something we make worse, but it's actually something we make much, much better. So we're infinitely safer from climate because of fossil fuels and industrial civilization. If you want to guarantee that people will become endangered more by climate, restrict fossil fuels. That's your simple solution if you want people to be at the mercy of nature. Now, it turns out that the exact same thing is true for environmental quality and resources. So I mentioned that there's this idea that the planet is perfect, it gives us a perfect climate, and all we do is ruin it. We have the same narrative for environmental quality. We have this idea, well, nature is clean, and we make it dirty. Well, it's true human beings can make things dirty, but nothing is remotely as dirty as nature without human development. So I like to use the example of, since the Pope recently spoke about this, I think of, well, what if the Pope from 300 years ago had come here today and talked to the current Pope? And the current Pope described it as, we've turned the earth into an immense pile of filth. And I find that really offensive. And I think the Pope from 300 years ago would think that was insane, because if you came to this work, you take any measure of environmental quality, take water quality. 300 years ago, even if you were really rich, what was water quality like? It's really bad, because nature doesn't give us an abundant supply of clean water. We need to purify it, and we need to transport it. Otherwise, we have all sorts of bacteria, all sorts of disease, all sorts of just being parched all the time. So whereas now we just turn on a faucet, we don't think about it. We have clean water. It's unbelievable. Or air. It's not like nature gives us clean air, because we need to keep ourselves warm, and historically you're using wood or coal, and you're breathing it in really nearby, whereas now this is probably powered by coal or something comparable. But we're not inhaling anything because of modern filtration technology, modern transmission technology that allows us to locate the plants away from where we're breathing for the most part. It's unbelievable what we have. There's water quality, sanitation. I mean, the world is so sanitary, it's so clean. We're surrounded by food. So if we really care about human beings, we have the best environment any human beings have ever lived. And energy is related to that. So energy doesn't take a perfect, nature's pristine environment and make it dirty. It takes a really naturally dirty, unhealthy environment and makes it clean. Now, we can create problems, and we need to be focused on those. But what we find is that over time, by using technology, we can not only take nature's dirt and clean it in effect, but we can take our own. So here's a graph of U.S. air pollution, different materials in the atmosphere. And in this time period, we increased our fossil fuel use, and yet all of these substances decreased in the atmosphere thanks to technology. And what that shows is it's completely compatible to use more fossil fuels and have less air pollution. But then you see there's these positive correlations too. As fossil fuel use goes up, more people have access to clean water because we have the energy to purify the water that is naturally dirty. Now with resources, the same idea. So we have the false idea is nature is perfect, we ruin it. The true thing is nature is amazing, has amazing potential, but we need to transform it to get that. Because nature does not give us a good standard of living, period. So we need to make ourselves safe from climate, we need to clean up our environment, and with resources, nature doesn't give us much in the way of usable resources. Now you might think, what are you talking about? You're talking about fossil fuels. Isn't that a natural resource? So let me take a survey. Who thinks oil and gas and coal are valuable natural resources? Okay. Who thinks they're not? You're wrong. So because natural is the problem. So oil and coal and gas are not naturally resources. So let me ask this. 1850, I give you a bucket of oil. Today you can do a lot with it. What can you do with it in 1850? Prevent it from ruining your clothes, basically. Right? It's useless. It's essentially useless to you. Natural gas. So oil was useless. And then we figured out a way how to make oil useful by transforming it from a useless raw material to a useful resource. But when we were exploring for oil, then there was this thing called natural gas, which was not a resource. It was actually an explosive thing that killed you when you were exploring for oil, which used to be a non-resource. And then we figured out how to turn that into a resource through human ingenuity. Or let's take any material. What about aluminum? Aluminum is one of the most abundant materials on the earth, and yet it was completely useless for most of history because we didn't know how to harness it. So we need a clear distinction in our mind between a raw material and a resource. So a resource is a raw material that has been rendered useful by the human mind. And the thing with resources, the reason this is relevant to oil is there's no problem with running out of resources because there's no problem with running out of raw materials. Nature is just all raw materials. It's just all matter and energy. So the only question is, can we use our minds to keep transforming those raw materials into usable energy and other things? And then the key thing is the key thing is the freedom to do that. Because let's take oil. So first of all, as I mentioned, there's dozens of times more oil on the earth than we've ever used. But who cares about oil really? Because what we should always want is let's find something better than oil. Let's find a more efficient way. Maybe there's a nuclear way of doing it. Maybe there's another way of doing it. So as long as we're free, we can both find as much oil as is useful, but we can also find as many alternatives that are useful, and we'll always use the best thing as long as we're free to choose the best. But the people who are anti-fossil fuels say, no, you shouldn't be free to choose fossil fuels, and you shouldn't be free to choose nuclear, you shouldn't be free to choose hydro, you shouldn't be free to frack, you shouldn't be free to do anything new, and then they say, and see, you're going to run out of resources, and that is exactly right. If you're not free, you will run out of resources very, very quickly, because you'll be consuming resources and you won't be producing them. But if we're free to produce resources, we don't have to worry about running out of anything. So the way I think of it is, I have no fear of running out of oil, but I have an extreme fear of running out of food. I think that's the proper attitude. And if you look at the history of this is borne out. So this is the history of us consuming oil, and this is what's called the proved reserve. So this is the amount of oil we know about and can get at an affordable price. So notice something, the consumption keeps going up, right? So the more we consume, the more we have. So we're not running out of it, we're running into it. Why is that? Because human ingenuity is outstripping our consumption. And again, this is just one thing. We can do it with other things. You can turn coal into oil. You can turn gas into oil. You can turn certain plant things into oil if you need to, if it makes sense. Or you can do other things without oil. So the reason that fossil fuels are so great is not they're the only way of getting energy, but they're the best way of getting energy now. We always want to be free to do things the best way. And we have a movement that says we should be prohibited from doing things the best way and forced to do them the worst way, namely solar and wind. So this is my summary of that. So to wrap up, we've got this, at the beginning I mentioned my core philosophy of this, which is that we're not thinking about this issue carefully in terms of human life. So we have to have as our standard what's going to benefit human life. We need to think about it carefully, and we need to define our terms. We need to look at the big picture, and we need to look at both positives and negatives. We need to look at all the alternatives. So that is it. I tried to give you an outline of how I think about that. The book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, goes into a lot more depth. But if you take away anything from that, I think you should take away that methodology of looking at this and any other problem. As a secondary thing to think about, I would say, question the view that you've been taught of the planet. Because in all of these issues, we have this idea that the planet is perfect, and our goal should be not to do anything to it, to be green. And I think that is the wrong way to think about the planet. Because the planet is not perfect for us. If you care about human beings, you have to realize we need to transform the planet dramatically to live really well. Now, in the process of that, we'll make mistakes. We'll do things wrong, but overall, we've made it a much, much better place to live. And I think we should appreciate that. And so when somebody says, oh, this isn't green or this isn't natural, that's not a mark against it. That could be, that's a good thing overall. We should be transforming. So my core philosophy is I'm against the whole green obsession. I think we should not be thinking about how to save the planet from human beings. As I said, we should be thinking about how to improve it for human beings. And if we keep the philosophy that we have in the culture, if we keep opposing fossil fuels in the name of, oh, let's use natural solar and wind, we will hurt real human beings, 100%. But positively, if we embrace what it means to be a human, which I think is to transform the world, to not be green, to be transformers, then you can help a lot of people. So I hope that you fill out the handout that I gave out. That'll give you a lot of information. If you already feel like you agree with this, you don't need to learn anything more. I think there's always more to learn, but make sure you do it at least to share it with a friend, because I mean, this age group, you know, a lot of you, I guess I'm considered a millennial too, so that's become an infinitely flexible term. But you know, your age group in the next election is considered the age group that will vote for what I view as energy tyranny. And it's considered a group that will be against fossil fuels, but there's no necessity in that. I was once young. I guess I became very passionate about that. I hope you understand why, and I hope that you do too. So let's take questions, but thanks for having me. Yes.
This might be a silly question, but one thing I've always wondered, if you go back 150 years and you do your average temperature, and I've seen studies too with the ocean temperatures from 150 years ago, I think of the thermometers, you know, back to the 70s, looking at it with my vision. And we're measuring temperatures nowadays with more accurate. How is that compensated for? So
Poorly.
So we really don't know what the swing is.
Correct. Well, I mean, so this is an interesting issue, because I'm really amazed by how intimidated people are. Actually, I'm interested by both how arrogant people are and how intimidated they are at the same time by any time the issue of science comes up. Because it's either this sledgehammer, you feel like, well, I'm on the side of science, I can make any claim I want, I don't even know what I'm talking about, or people don't even ask kind of common sense questions. Like, so I think it's the opposite of a silly question. Because I gave you this data about 150 years ago, you might say, wait, how good were the thermometers back then? But also think about what the data was for. The data was not for a particular location, right? It's called a global mean temperature anomaly. So this is the temperature of the entire globe. How do you take a temperature of an entire globe? It's really hard to do it accurately, and yet people act like they can do it perfectly. So for our purposes, in the book, I try to qualify this and explain, you can only know it within these parameters. But it's very important that people explain, if they're doing this kind of science, that there's a lot of ambiguity, and they particularly have to explain if they change the data, which has happened repeatedly. So there's become a popular term in the field called upjustments, where people over time, quote unquote, discover that, oh, it's hotter than we thought it was, or it's colder. So let me just go back to some of this, just so you can see. So like here, you see how you have these things going up and down? Well, people who have the theory that more CO2 is going to lead to a very dramatic warming try to smooth out the different periods, right? So they'll try to say, well, in the 40s, when you have it going up a lot, and when you did have it going up a lot, and you have things like the Dust Bowl, they try to flatten that out, and they try to increase the recent so that it looks like a nicer graph for the purposes of their theory. Because the graph, and the most notorious example of this was called the hockey stick, where if you've seen Al Gore's movie, this has been since retracted from the literature, but basically what they tried to show is that since the Middle Ages, or since the year zero, the temperature has gone like that. And this was just completely known to be untrue. There was something called the medieval warm period, and it was actually like this, but it was inconvenient, no pun intended, for that movie and for all these people. So, but they just completely manipulated it. But the way they act about it, my main point is, they act like, oh, I just stuck a thermometer in the earth and this is what happened. No discussion versus admitting, hey, this is a really complex thing. Here's our best understanding of it. And if I made a big change, I need to tell you I made a big change. So if like Michael Mann, the guy who came up with the hockey stick, like when he's talking about it, he acted like, oh, this is just obvious, versus I completely contradict all of the literature and history about this issue, which he did. They called it, there are all these clever ways of making fun of people, but his was called, his is his MANN, so man-made global warming is his little discovery. Yes, in the back.
Well, with the many uses for oil, how do you endorse, burning it to produce energy when there's so many uses, like it can make us fly, but why should we use it to heat our houses when there are all these other forms of energy?
Wait a second, but you burn it when you make yourself fly.
Well, I was, sorry, I don't know another way to make a plane fly, so that's the, only example, but they have electric cars, they have cars that run on natural gas, and instead we burn a lot of it instead of making it into the goods, sort of goods we use every day.
So why do you think we do that? So just to be clear on the issue is, if you look at the uses of oil, so one of the major uses of oil, not percentage-wise, but one of the cool things about it that got me excited about it is you make all of these what are called petroleum products. So like, this plastic bottle can be derived from oil. It's this black glop that these brilliant engineers can break it up and mix it up and build it up back together into what are called polymers, and they can make everything from a bulletproof vest to the sole of your shoe. I mean, it's unbelievable what they can do. So his point is that we don't just do that. He thinks we should just do that with oil, and yet we're burning it. So I'm asking you, so let's say 10% of the time we use it to make stuff like this, and 90% of the time we burn it. Why do you think that is? I'm curious.
Because it's cheap and easy to crack with the lesser fuels. Natural gas is a little more difficult to store and ship. It's just kind of a marriage of convenience.
How do you feel about marriages of convenience?
I don't know. Personally,
Well, marriage of convenience I don't think is a accurate thing, but the basic idea is the reason why we use anything for anything if we're free is because we judge it as the most efficient way of accomplishing our goals. So for instance, even with this kind of thing, a lot of the plastics now are derived from natural gas because natural gas is way cheaper than oil. So over the years, they've found more ways to get different kinds of petroleum products from natural gas. So what free individuals do, again, is they're always finding what they think are the best uses of resources. And I don't think there's anything inherently better about making a plastic bottle than than driving a tractor. It's just a question of how much it's worth to different people. Now, I think the premise behind this is, well, we're going to run out of it. Like we're running through, we're going to run out of it. First, there was no it before the industry and the free people. So I don't agree, like even if we consumed all the oil, I wouldn't feel guilty about it at all because we created the value from the oil. So you'd go from nothing to nothing. It's not like we stole anything or something like that. But as a matter of fact, what happens over time is as you use more and more, you're developing all of this new knowledge and you're finding newer and better ways of creating things. So it's sort of the opposite of the situation. We now have more and more ways of making things. And you can do it with plants if you want to. You can do it with gas, you can do it with coal. We used to do these kinds of products with coal to the extent we could, then we did more with oil, now we do a lot of those with gas. So it's just a constant process of innovation. I know a lot of engineers they dislike the idea of burning something, and they like the idea of synthesizing it. And I think you gotta get over that, because burning it is really good. It gets really, really good if it's the most efficient thing to burn. And if you really, in the future, if you really need to, you can synthesize it using you could ultimately synthesize the raw material. So I've heard that before, but I like flying, and I feel good about the flying, and I feel good about the plastic cup that I use when I fly, because we created all of it, and we're going to find better ways to create all of it in the future, not worse, if we're free. Tyler.
So last semester I took an ecology class,
Okay.
and the professor who touted her Ivy League credentials said that.
What did she say? I went to Harvard.
Yeah.
Obey.
Yeah, Harvard. Yeah. And she said that she was worried about climate warming, and that due to climate models, and she showed us the models in class, said that we can expect to essentially see all of our coastal cities drown from melted ice. Is there previously used models that didn't work? I mean, are those the same kinds of models that we're still using today to try and say those predictions?
So the first chapter of my book is called The Secret History of Fossil Fuels. And there's two elements to it. One is that all the predictions that fossil fuels could be replaced with these other things have been coming false for the last several decades. But maybe even more importantly, all these catastrophic predictions. So the Miami's underwater, that's decades old. I mean, we have newspaper clippings of people saying, decades ago, Miami's underwater, New York's underwater. It's really far-fetched that this would happen even if the temperature went up in the way that they project. So with each there's like a chain of speculation, because they're speculating about how the temperature is going to go, but then people also speculate on top of that how storms are going to go, how sea level is going to go, and they're not even good at correlating those later things. But the core thing is the temperature is not going up, and there is no model that predicts accurate. I mean, by definition, of the situation, there is no accurate model that predicts dramatic warming, or that has predicted it so far. So the only thing you can do, if you know how to manipulate variables, is you can basically throw out your old model that predicted this dramatic warming, and then you can make it flat, and then you can add a new variable that says this is sort of mean, but you're basically saying, I'm caricaturing it, but not really, as in, after the year 2015, make it go up. That's in effect what you can add to the model, right? You can add anything you want when you're just dealing with mathematical functions, because if you know how to do math, you just add different parameters, and you can make it look good. And you can what's called reverse fit. You can fit the curve to the past. So basically, you can look at the whole past, and you can say, oh, I've got a model that perfectly predicted the past. But this is called hindcasting, and it's very dubious, right? The real test of a model is kind of do forecasting before the data is in, and they can't do that at all. So all she's doing is she's relying on the climate prediction models that can't predict climate, and that's very dishonest. She might not even know, because she probably learned it from someone else with an Ivy League degree, and so she didn't feel like questioning it either. But that's just completely dishonest to say, I have a prediction, and you should take it as gospel when there's no basis for it. And it's not, but you should do this with all predictions. I mean, don't people read the papers over the years and notice that all the predictions are wrong, like constantly? It's like the psychic on New Year's that tells you, a new thing every year. There's this I heard this story about this psychic on the radio, and a marketer that her family asked the station, so she's been on the last 22 years, like name some things she's been right about. And they said, oh no, she's never been right, but people like hearing the predictions. But that's true, people like these predictions. A sea level rise, I don't have the stat here, but it's we can send you the website, but if anyone wants, the website is moralcaseforfossilfuels.com. We have all the graphs that I have in the book and the ones I showed here. Sea level, if you want to measure sea level rise, the best way is what's called tidal gauge data, because that is you're in one location, and just over time you measure how high it's going. And what you see is all of those are flat. Now the sea level goes up and down naturally, but sometimes it goes down over time, sometimes it goes up and down, but the rate doesn't change. And that's just because there hasn't been a significant increase in sea level. Versus, by the way, in the last 20,000 years, before man started using fossil fuels, we had a 400-foot increase in sea level rise. So there's a really good tweet that said, it was a little partisan, but it said, 400 feet sea level rise in the last 20,000 years. Obama thinks the last 2 inches is your fault. So your teacher is sort of assuming, even on Wikipedia, which is incredibly biased, go to sea level rise, you'll see the sea level rise has been slow. It's like this, because it was so big coming out of the last ice age.
One more question.
Okay, one more question. Everyone feels pressure. It can be a bad question. The best questions are bad questions. I was going to ask myself a question. Oh, go for it.
What about the effect of CO2 on the ocean?
All right, that's where I thought one of you were going. Yeah. So the first thing to notice about this thing, so this is called ocean acidification, which we can talk about the term in a second. But the first thing to notice about this issue is how late in the party it came and when it came to the party as a major issue. So you have this phenomenon, if we now call it climate change rather than global warming. Because global warming is not a perfect term, but it's a more accurate term, because it conveys the essence of the situation. As we put more CO2 in the atmosphere, it leads to more warming, this leads to other problems, whereas climate change is super vague. So what happened is they made these dramatic predictions of global warming, and then they didn't happen. And then and only then did ocean acidification become a popular issue. So it'd be different if they said in the 70s and 80s, we're going to put more CO2 in the atmosphere, that's also going to be more CO2 in the water, because they balance each other out. And what we really need to be worried about is ocean acidification. If they had said that, I would respect it a lot more. What I do not respect is people making dramatic claims about temperature, and then those come false, and then they try to shut those aside. So that's not to say it's not a legitimate issue, but we should be suspicious. Now, you should really be suspicious if you look at the nature of the data, because, well, first of all, that term is ridiculous. So, ocean acidification. What does that mean? You have a pH scale. It goes from 0 to 14, and below 7 is acidic, and above 7 is basic or alkaline. And anyone know what the ocean is? This is well over 8. So ocean is basic. So whatever it's declined, it's become slightly less basic. To the extent they can measure, which they can measure much worse than they can measure any of the temperature. So what we just have no proof of is that there's anything at all significant going on here. It's kind of like climate, the equation of change with catastrophe. But by historical standards, there's nothing interesting about it. And there's a lot of reasons to think that it'll help certain species. It's another case of the phenomenon where there's such a thing as change that isn't that big a deal. But the reason people think it's a big deal is because they think the planet is perfect and we are destroyers of the planet. So it's that religion that it's basically thou shalt not change anything that makes them call it acidification and makes them think of, oh my gosh, the fish are going to die. So I found it all to be pseudoscience and with the same dogma that's driving everything else. But it's the kind of thing, by the way, one should, even though the exponents of this are very irrational, one should be open to evidence. I mean, anytime you're making changes, you should be open to, is there evidence that there's some real negative? But this equation of change and catastrophe is constantly going on. And they're always trying to, the more clearly they define the catastrophe, the more easily it's refuted. So ocean acidification is nice, because notice it doesn't name any particular consequence to that. So all it would be like calling it CO2ification of the air. Like the more CO2 you create, the more CO2ification of the air. Okay? Well, what does that mean? And the context is, just to bring it back to the core thing, the context is not just we're debating this in a vacuum. The context is these are the justifications people are giving for taking away people's energy. Like they're saying, because of this ocean acidification, you shouldn't be able to use as much energy. So by that standard, it's really, I think, immoral the way they're representing it. And we need energy freedom. That's the basic thing. So thank you. And if anyone wants an I Love Fossil Fuels pin, you can come and say hi.
Thank you everyone for coming. We do have a few sandwiches left. Feel free to take one on your way out.